4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
High and low, it's how I roll. A shooting star in a film noir. I'm floating around 10 feet on the ground. I'm floating around 10 feet on the ground. I am no average Joe. Be with me and you will see more than you ever wanted to.
Hey there, folks. How are you this evening? I guess this early evening. John Baranchuk here. Thanks for attending Grasping Sasquatch Stories and Science. I want to thank all of you who attended last week and all of you who are attending again this week. Appreciate it if you would subscribe. The subscribing really helps us out. Today, we're going to be doing part 2 of Fight Flight, dealing with anxiety and fear. I put this together with Bigfoot in mind, but these same things that I'm talking about will help anyone coping with anxiety, and we're probably going to get to some specific techniques probably next show. We may be able to introduce them this show. We'll see how time goes. But the first thing I want to do today is I want to just briefly review the Bigfoot joke, the Sasquatch joke with you. When I watched my show last week, I realized that I really didn't pull the point together succinctly. And it's a pretty important point to my book and to what I think we need to do to prove the existence of Sasquatch. So we're going to start with that. Scientific Bigfoot research joke, ? A policeman sees a drunk searching for something under the streetlight. He asks the drunk, what has he lost? He says he's lost the keys, and they both look for him under the streetlight. After a few minutes, the police ask if he's sure he's lost them there, and the drunk replies no, that he lost them back there in the park. The policeman asks, why is he searching here? And the drunk replies, this is where the light is. And again, I think this is part of what is going on in the Bigfoot community. We've got some of the biggest names in the field shining the light for us. Jeff Meldrum shining the light on footprints and footcasts. Ron Moorhead shining the light on audio recordings, vocalizations, sounds, and communication. And so it seems to me, at least, that that's where the bulk of the research has focused, because that's where the light is being shined. And there's nothing wrong with shining the light in that area at all. Not at all. But there's a good chance there are some other keys laying around under the ground or on the ground, not just where the light is being shined, but outside of that light. And we need to do something to look for those other keys as well. And that's the spirit, in one of the spirits in which my book was written. The statistical and experimental design sections of my book, which we will eventually get to in this live YouTube show on down the line, I'd say. They offer an alternative for how to look for those keys and how to shine some light on those keys, even though they're not right under the street lamp. And so that's the main point I wanted to make about that joke that I didn't feel I put together very clearly last time. So the format of this show is me telling a story, sometimes personal, sometimes not, or reading some kind of encounter story, and then tying this into the science behind that story. So I don't have too many encounter stories, but we are gonna get into one of my personal fight-flight stories today. And this story starts actually at an expedition that I was on, where Scott Carpenter, may he rest in peace, was the presenter. I had the good fortune of witnessing him give a talk about his books and about his philosophies. And this was on one of my initial expeditions, so I was pretty green, pretty set in my ways. As a result, I listened to him, but honestly walked away quite a bit skeptical. He was talking about how Sasquatches can influence their environment. He was talking about how they can cloak and uncloak. Of course, he advanced the theory that they were Nephilim or Nephilim, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And I walked away from that pretty skeptical. Couldn't believe that these things could cloak or shift from dimension to dimension, couldn't be seen when they're right there in front of you. So about 3 or 4 weeks after that expedition, I decided to go out on my own for my very first time. And in going out on my own, I picked a spot that I thought looked pretty squatchy. And in doing so, I found a spot that was actually right next to the road. About 30 feet in, there was multiple campsites, but they were primitive campsites. They had a pad for you to set up your tent. In my case, I have a mini trailer, and a fire ring and a table and a pole to hang your lamp on. And got set up. I brought my then pit bull mix. His name was Red. I had rescued him from a local pound. He has since passed, but took him with me, had him tied up on a long rope around a tree. But before we got to that point, we scoped out the area. This particular spot, and what I thought made it squatchy, was the fact that it had ridges on either side of the camping area. And those ridges went way back, probably 2-3 miles back towards a major mountain. If you were looking at the mountain on the left side of the area, the ridge came down next to a stream. So it had water, it had high ground, it had lots of trees and mountainous area. And that's one of the things, those are some of the factors that I believe make an area squatchy. So we scoped the place out, went walk towards the mountain, too lazy to walk all the way to the mountain, but walked to the mountain and walked on back, looking for tracks, looking for any kind of sign. Saw nothing, much to my surprise, because again, it really looked squatchy to me. So by this time, it was getting closer to sunset, not yet sunset. Started up a fire, cooked dinner, and it's right about dusk at the point that I'm finishing out dinner. And I'm sitting there next to the campfire, and all of a sudden my dog Red, at this point he's tied to around a tree with a long rope, so that he can move pretty much freely. He sits up, looks directly at the entrance to the camping area, sticks his nose up in the air so that he's sniffing the clouds, totally at a 90-degree angle, if you will, nose straight up in the air. And he sits there sniffing the air for 5 minutes. I have never seen this dog do this before. And I'm wondering, what the heck is going on? When he brings, after about 5 minutes of sitting and sniffing like that, when he brings his head down, he starts growling and snarling and snapping and barking. And it's as if he's barking and looking at something right in front of me. And it was unbelievable. I've never seen him act like this. And clearly, from observing him, he was sensing or seeing something that seemed very close, very close. But I couldn't see a darn thing. So I went and got my headlamp, put on my headlamp, said, "Come on, Red, let's go check this thing out." Red, excuse me, Red, bless his heart, he didn't want to come forward with me. He scurried back under the trailer, would not come forward with me. So I started walking forward, and at that point I started to reconsider and rethink Scott Carpenter's idea that these things can cloak or shift dimensions, be right in front of you and you can't see them. And actually, as I was thinking about that and walking forward, I was thinking, boy, wouldn't it be something if I would just bump right into this thing if it's a Bigfoot? That didn't happen. Walked to the road, walked out into the road, looked up and down the road, didn't see a darn thing, not a thing. Walked back in, still expecting to bump into something, didn't see a thing, didn't bump into anything. Went and got Red out from under the trailer, and he was very reluctant to come out. I kind of had to pull him out a little bit, coax him out. And we got back to our position sitting around the campfire. About 3 minutes passed, we're sitting there, and all of a sudden he gets up and looks at what would have been about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock from my seating position. So it was slightly to my right and behind me. And he sticks his nose up in the air again, just like the first time. But this time, instead of just sticking his nose up in the air and sitting there for 5 minutes, it's not 5 seconds. And he brings his head down and again just starts losing it, barking, growling, snarling, just looking like he wants to tear something up. And he is going crazy, even more aggressive in terms of his growls and his snarls and baring his teeth than he was the first time. And above all the commotion he's making, I hear this. Well, that's when my fight flight kicked in. To keep this PG or G in terms of rating, let's just say that one of my orifices puckered, and it wasn't my mouth, my ears, or my eyes. And I stood up, slowly walked to my car, got out went into my glove compartment where I carry a 45 Smith & Wesson M&P, got it out and chambered around. And when I chambered around, the bushes that were moving and rustling during this whole story stopped. Sat back down for a few minutes, and we both, Red and I, at that point had enough, because this scared the bejesus out of me. So we both climbed in the trailer, locked the trailer doors, and I was expecting to be hearing rocks or pebbles or something, maybe him coming up and slapping the trailer. Thankfully, none of that happened. Now, I've heard bears growl in the woods, which they have at this area that I was located. And I've heard big cats. There's also big cats. I've heard them growl and snarl in the woods. And this growl that I heard was not one of those animals. I've also heard a Bigfoot on my very first expedition. Heard a Bigfoot growl above and roar above a pack of coyotes. And although the intensity of this growl wasn't as loud, it still was certainly recognizable, and I remain convinced that it was a Bigfoot growl. I didn't see the Bigfoot. All I could see was something rustling in bushes about 30 yards away from me. So that was an example of my fight-flight response. Not a very dramatic one at that, but nonetheless, my orifice puckering and going and getting my gun, I was getting ready to fight because I was in fear of my life. So, our topic is fight-flight. And so, we're going to move on to talk about fight-flight right now. The human nervous system consists of two divisions: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And let me digress just a minute. If you have questions as I'm doing this presentation, by all means, type them in all capital letters, and I'll try and field questions as we go. If you want to chat amongst yourself, that's great as well. Keep those in lowercase so that I know you're chatting amongst yourselves rather than asking me a question. So back to the human nervous system. It's got two divisions: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Most of us are probably familiar with the central nervous system. It's the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, periphery means away from, or away from the center. So the peripheral nervous system are all the nerves running from the spine to the different muscles and bones and organs in our body. And the peripheral nervous system has two divisions: the musculoskeletal system, which includes the muscles and the bones. Everybody knows we've got nerves running to our muscles. You may not be aware, we've got nerves in our bones as well. And I imagine if you've ever broken a leg, that became pretty obvious, or an arm or limb. But then the second division of the peripheral nervous system that we're concerned with, and this is the big one that we're concerned with from fight flight, because this is the one that creates our fight flight syndrome, or our fight flight response, if you will, in conjunction with what's called the hypothalamus in the brain. It's if you will, a particular organ in the brain that's one of the main switching stations. And in the autonomic nervous system, we've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. There won't be a test at the end of this presentation. You do not need to remember all these medical terms, but the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is the on switch, if you will. It's what kicks in that fight flight. It's the on switch. It's the excitatory switch. It gets all those organs going, getting us ready to fight or flee. You know, the classic example of another animal that has fight flight is the opossum. The opossum, I always thought they just played dead as part of the fight flight response, and that's their way of fleeing. They play dead, hoping that the predator will think they're dead and not mess with them. But I found an opossum in our garage when I was a kid growing up, and as I approached it, I expected it to play dead. Well, this thing did not play dead. It fought. It bared its teeth and its claws and was lunging at me. And so that's the excitatory part of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic division, the on switch. The parasympathetic division of the nervous system is the off switch, or the calming switch, if you will. Take the example of somebody jumping out from behind a bush and startling you. Well, initially, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, you tense up, the adrenaline starts going, you have a startle response, you're ready to fight or flee. But then when you realize that it's somebody that's just messing with you and playing a joke with you, what happens? I can't believe you did that to me. You scared me stiff, or you scared the poop out of me. That's the parasympathetic division kicking in and calming you down. The fight-flight response is what's known as an atavistic phenomena. And again, don't have to remember the fancy word atavism, but what it means is it's Mother Nature's way of protecting us. It's hardwired into our body. It's an automatic response. You don't have to think about, okay, I'm going to tense my muscles. I'm going to get my heart beating fast so the adrenaline starts pumping through my body. All that happens automatically. And if you want to remember the autonomic nervous system, or you don't want to remember it, but you want to remember it, what it does, I just think of it as the automatic nervous system. It has the on switch and the off switch that clicks on and off automatically and takes care of your body. In a second here, well, we'll move on to the next slide. Well, no, we won't. We'll first define fight and flight. The fight or flight syndrome, first outlined by Harvard University physiologist Walter Cannon in the 1920s, describes a sequence of activity regulated by the stress center of the brain, the hypothalamus. It controls the autonomic nervous system and activates the pituitary gland, which is the master hormone secretion, growth, and regulation gland, to prepare the body for combat and struggle or running away for safety. The blood vessels in the skin, the skeletal muscles, the brain, and the viscera constrict. The blood vessels are getting tighter and shrinking down in your hands and feet. That way, more blood is pumped to the core of your body to protect your vital organs. When the parasympathetic or the off switch kicks in, those veins deconstrict, they open up wider, and more blood starts flowing to your periphery, your hands, your feet, and your brain. When the on switch kicks in, the pupils dilate for far vision, sweating increases, the bronchi, which are in your lungs, produce more rapid and shallow breathing. They dilate and your breathing gets more rapid and shallow. Skin and body hair produce goose pimples. One of my other fight-flight stories, I guess for next week, the guy experienced that. Not only did he have goose pimples, but his hair was standing on end as if you were putting it into electrical field and all your hairs were standing at attention. The heart accelerates the rate of beating, increases the strength of contraction. So again, your muscles get tense. You're ready to either start punching or running. The digestive tract decreases its internal contractions to reduce digestion, and secretions of digestive fluids decrease, which can create stomach pain, nausea, and vomiting. Again, stomach pain, nausea, or vomiting. These are all part of the on switch being flipped. The adrenal glands stimulate adrenaline, thereby giving your body an energy rush or surge and making us feel tense and shaky. The anal sphincter closes, the blood vessels in the genitals dilate, causing genital discomfort. The liver reduces sugar into the bloodstream. We adopt these processes into our language when we talk about being scared stiff, frozen by fear. Sometimes we lose control of our bodily functions and we get the piss scared out of us, or we are scared, to keep it PG again, scared poopless. Think of an anxiety or a panic attack and recognize how many of these processes occur during one of those. Physiologically, there's no difference between fear and anxiety reactions. To our body, it doesn't matter whether it's anxiety or fear. Well, what's the difference? Fear is those physiologic responses in response to a real and present threat. You're seeing the Bigfoot in front of you. You're hearing the growl. You're hearing its breathing. It's a reality. It's right there. Anxiety are those same physiologic responses to an imaginary or not immediate and present threat. When I get ready to go out on a night expedition, I start feeling a little anxious because I'm wanting to see a Bigfoot. And that's the difference between fear and anxiety. Fear is all these physical reactions in our body to a very real and present threat. Anxiety is those same physiologic responses to an imaginary threat or not immediately present threat. So here we go. We're looking at the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. You can see the brain. You can see the spinal cord running in yellow. It's also labeled down the length of our spine. But then you'll see some green and red dots. The red are more visible on my screen. On my right-hand side of my screen, which I guess would be your left. I'm still getting used to this blue screen thing or green screen thing. Well, on the top, you see the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. When sympathetic division kicks in, the pupils dilate. It inhibits salvation. Your bronchi constrict, your breathing become more shallow and quicker. Your heart starts beating faster, stimulates hormone secretions, adrenal secretions. You hold on to your urine and you hold on to your feces because you don't want to be peeing or pooping when you're in the middle of getting ready to fight or flee. After the threat has passed, the pupils dilate again. Your mouth begins to secrete saliva. Your breathing becomes more deep and regular. Your heart rate slows down. As it slows down, the veins in your arms and legs expand, and to your brain expand, and let more blood flow to those areas. Your digestion kicks in, and you're more likely to feel like you need to poop or pee. So you do that. Any questions about this? I'm sorry if you're hearing my phone go off in the background. It's in another room, but it's occasionally ringing in the background, or not ringing, beeping in the background. Any questions about the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the nervous system? They don't talk about this in here, but the autonomic nervous system also regulates fluid distribution in your body, your hair growth, your skin flaking off. Anything that your body does automatically to take care of itself and maintain itself is controlled and mediated by the autonomic nervous system. The belief is, and for a long time the belief was, that this is automatic. We can't control it. As a result, people just thought we were helpless when we would get a fight-flight response. But another mission in my book is to help people realize that you can't control it completely, but you can learn to modulate it or manage it. And so in the first half of my book, Psychological Horizons in Scientific Bigfoot Research, soon to become Grasping Sasquatch, I kind of talk about why I believe in Bigfoot, but the bulk of the first part of the book is kind of a self-help book, talking about the fight-flight response, talking about the autonomic nervous system, and also giving you specific techniques that that you can use to learn to modulate or control your fight-flight response. Because when you get down to it, you don't want to be too relaxed, but you don't want to be too panicky either. And this is an arousal chart, if you will, the Yerkes-Dodson law. On the one line, you see the quality of performance. And we're talking about performance not just physically, but mentally. Sports, thinking, reaction times, even a sport like fishing involves this curve. You'll see on the bottom line, it says levels of arousal, and both lines go from low to high. So what it turns out is there's an optimum level of arousal to perform at your greatest. On the low end, when arousal is low and your quality of performance is low, that's when you're sleeping. Okay? As you wake up, get on with your day, your arousal begins to increase following that bell curve, but you may come across, get bored. Okay? You're still not going to be at your optimum level of performance because you're not at an optimum level of arousal. As arousal increases, you see there's mild alertness. As arousal increases further, it reaches the optimum level of performance. This is where you want to be when you're taking a test. This is where you want to be when you're playing a sport. Fishing. I'm going to use fishing as an example because a good friend of mine, Eric Sell, him and I are big fishermen, and we were talking about this just the other day. When you go out and fish, especially if you're fishing in a tournament, you get real excited. And especially if you're fishing in the times of year when the bite is slow, winter and summer, the hottest times of the year and the closest times of the year, the fish get stagnant. They're not active. And so if you're fishing at these times of year and you're excited to get out in the water and catch a fish, probably what's going to happen is that excitement is going to put you over that hump to the stress or the anxiety level, hopefully not to the panic level if you're fishing. But as a result, you're going to fish fast. You're going to throw that line out as far as you can, and then you're going to reel it in. And not no matter how hard you try, but initially, until you realize you're doing this, you're going to be retrieving your lure faster than the fish can react to it because they're so lethargic, because they don't want to move fast. And so you're likely not to catch as many fish because you're blazing your lure right by the fish, be it a crankbait, be it a worm, whatever the case may be. So you got to relax. You got to slow yourself down and reach that optimum level of arousal. If you go past that optimum level of arousal, you get stress, and you'll notice that your performance begins to decline. As you get more aroused, you get anxiety. Your performance decreases even more. And then as arousal gets to the high range, that's where panic and panic attacks and fight-flight responses kick in. So probably a lot of the people listening are interested in having a Class A encounter. But you do not want to have a fight-flight reaction. because on one hand, you want to remain calm, you want to remain at ease, but not so calm and at ease that you're like a limp biscuit. Hold on a second. My puppy dog is getting into things here. No, Hoss. Yeah. If you have a fight-flight response, you're either going to run like heck, get out of there, or you're going to try and respond by fighting back. In general, that's not a fight you're going to win, I don't think, with a Bigfoot. If, on the other hand, you're too relaxed, you fall asleep, you're bored, you're barely alert, that's not going to serve you well in a Class A encounter as well. So you don't want to be too relaxed, but you don't want to be too overstimulated. You want to be calm enough not to have a fight-flight response, but not so calm that you don't move for cover or you don't do things to protect yourself. If you can remain at that optimum level of performance, you're going to be more likely to keep your head and think about what's the best thing to do. Do we want to move forward? Do we want to hide behind a rock? Do we want to just stand our ground? You got several options in those types of encounters. And so you want to maintain an optimum level of arousal in a Bigfoot encounter. And some of the techniques that I'm probably going to have time to touch on a little bit today are going to involve relaxing. But again, you don't want to be as relaxed as a limp noodle and as calm as you're about to fall asleep in a Bigfoot encounter. That's not going to serve you well. Your flip side is you don't want to be panicking and having a full-blown fight-flight response either. You want to find that happy balance somewhere in between. And that's what these techniques that we'll be talking about are designed to do, is to help you, one, learn to modulate or manage your autonomic nervous system, your fight-flight response. But then after you learn to influence some level of control over that, manage it, modulate it, then you want to work towards an optimal level of arousal. Again, I'm thinking, I'm a trained psychologist, worked in neuropsychology and pain psychology, and in doing so, also worked with war vets and people in accidents that have been traumatized. And these techniques that we're going to be discussing are the very techniques I taught my patients to do and to use to treat their post-traumatic stress disorder. No, I'm not saying that you have post-traumatic stress disorder, but our fight-flight response can be part of a trauma. It can be part of an encounter. And if you learn to modulate or manage that fight-flight response, you're going to have a much better encounter, a much more productive research encounter. So let's see what the next slide has to offer. Okay, we're going to remove that. So I'm looking at some questions here. Jenicky 1044. I've noticed that some people freeze and can't do anything. That falls under what category? Awesome question, my friend, and actually stimulates part of my talk for the at this part of my show. The model that I provided for you of fight-flight is an older model. It's been a model that's been around for quite some time. Some psychologists and researchers are advancing a new model, and it's called fight, fight, freeze, faint, or flop, depending on the person, the theorist, and fawn. Fight, 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 flight, freeze, flop, or fawn. We've already talked about the fight, flight part, and that freezing initially would have been attributed to just being part of that response. And I truly, I believe it is part of that response. Again, you've heard the saying, scared stiff. We're so frightened we can't move. Okay. So with this new model, though, they're specifically speaking to that reaction, fight, flight, freeze. Your muscles tighten up. You're anxious. You're frightened. You're scared stiff. And so that's part of the newer model. It was part of the older model, but just one of the specific reactions to fight, flight. Now they're highlighting that specific category of response, calling it freeze. The next addition to it is something called faint, or other researchers call it flop. Basically, you're fainting, you're flopping down onto the ground out of extreme fear. I think that's pretty self-explanatory to people. I think most people understand what feigning or falling down onto the ground because you're losing consciousness is. The last addition to this model is something called fawn. And it's a little more difficult to relate it to Bigfoot, but we can relate it to Bigfoot. Fawning, it's most understandable in the trauma, especially spouse abuse trauma. Fawning is basically fawning over the perpetrator. By fawning, meaning trying to become friends with, trying to not provoke the perpetrator, trying to make it okay, waiting on them hand and foot, trying to not provoke that traumatic and violent beating or that traumatic and violent encounter. And although I've never had a class A, sometimes people do fawn to Bigfoot when they have that. Some people experience mind speak where they're told not to move any further. And they listen to that mind speak. They turn around and back off. So fawning is trying to obey the rules and regulations and not provoke your traumatizer. Jenke, I hope that answers your question. See your other question. Any other questions? No? Going once. Going twice. And we're going to move on. Looks like we've got enough time just for a preview or a tease of episode 3. This is probably going to end up being a 4 to 6 episode series till we're all said and done. I'm just hitting the highlights of these techniques, which we're about to look at on this podcast, on this live YouTube show. At the risk of doing a commercial, all these techniques are spelled out in detail in my book, Psychological Horizons in Scientific Bigfoot Research, available on Amazon, and of course will be also available when the book is republished and renamed Grasping Sasquatch. So if you really want to get good with this stuff, although I'm going to try and demonstrate all of these things, it's not going to be a full demonstration. And in the book, not only do I speak to how these things are done, but in the appendix of the book, I have specific relaxation scripts written out, specific guided imagery scripts written out, all the steps for self-hypnosis. And that systematic desensitization is an error on my part. I'm going to be teaching you guys something called neurolinguistic programming, which relates to this belief that our thoughts and our behaviors influence the connections that our neurons make in our brain and therefore become behavioral patterns. And I'm going to teach you something called the swish technique, which allows you to reformulate and create new connections for more helpful behavioral patterns. And then the one that could take up to 2 shows is stress inoculation, formerly called systematic desensitization for us old farts. So that's what the future holds in terms of the upcoming shows. I provided you the scientific and theoretical foundation of fight flight in these first 2 shows. And now we're going to move on to learning to modulate or reprogram is how I talk about it in the book. I'm going to teach you relaxation techniques. I'm going to teach you something called pursed lip breathing. I'm going to teach you something called autogenic relaxation. And I'm going to teach you something called progressive relaxation. Now, I could do a whole weekend seminar on just relaxation. So again, I don't want to mislead you and think that we're going to all get relaxed and I'm going to take you through a full induction. I'm not going to do that. Again, if you want to do that, go get the book. The scripts are in there, specific details. I encourage people to record it onto a DVD player or a cassette tape, showing my age, and talk yourself through it as if you're doing it to yourself, and then just listen to that tape. I'm going to teach you about a couple forms of guided imagery. Again, a show that probably is going to be a 2-show episode is going to be self-hypnosis. I'm going to show you all the steps involved in doing self-hypnosis. I personally believe that all hypnosis is self-hypnosis because it's something that occurs to us every night when we go to sleep and every morning when we wake up. We pass through a trance level of consciousness. And all you're doing in self-hypnosis is training yourself to stay in that trance level of awareness, getting in touch with the unconscious mind, and then speaking to the unconscious mind. So there are 7 steps in self-hypnosis. I'll be sharing those 7 steps and reviewing each of those steps with you in some depth. Maybe modeling the voice that I use or some of the things that I say when I'm working with a hypnotic subject. Neurolinguistic programming, I've already talked about, and stress inoculation, or formerly known as systematic desensitization. That's the biggie. This is the one that I used with my clients who had serious trauma from war, serious trauma from a car accident, or witnessing a killing or being shot at. And this is a pretty detailed procedure. And again, all spelled out, including scripts and examples of my own stress inoculation process that I use for myself for Bigfoot. And we'll get into that. So, any questions? We've got 3 minutes, if you will, 3 minutes for questions. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have. I've got the gift of gab, and rarely do I not hold forth. So, anybody have any questions? Boy, I must be a great teacher. I must be a great explainer that no one has any questions. I think by way of summary, fight, flight, be it fight, flight, or fight, flight, freeze, flop, or fawn. This is our nervous system's way of protecting us from threats. It happens automatically. But even though it's not under voluntary control, typically, we can learn to modulate it and manage that response on our own. And we can learn to reprogram our fight-flight response to reach that optimum level of arousal where we're not aroused enough or we're aroused too much. So I want to thank all you guys for being a great audience listening. I appreciate the questions. The shows are just going to get better. If you really want to learn to modulate your fight-flight response, the next several shows are going to be what you're here for, because that's when we're going to be talking about these techniques, and I'm going to be modeling some of those. So it looks like we're going to close the show out here today. I'm going to ask you to keep your mind open, your boots on the ground, and your heart with your higher power. Have a good evening, guys. Thank you.
I see you running out of reason. Don't try to blame it on the seasons. Why you wanna walk away? When we began, swear we had something that would last. Baby, has a feeling best. Falling in was easy. How do I make it stay? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Oh, I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Was I a fool? I know sometimes I may wander, but I would never leave asunder a thing as good as what we have. Is it a rule? What's good is worth the fighting. There ain't no denying that you and I were made to last. Falling in is easy. How can we make it stay? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Tried and true. I will never let go of you. Tried and true. I Can we go back to the start? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Tried and true.
Wanna do it all with you by my side. If you're in, meet me here tonight. Be brave and come along, I'll be your ride.